here at Lakeland College, Japan, and we teach or have taught in both the EAP program and the academic program. And today we're going to talk about some strategies for dealing with controversial language and topics that come up in the classroom. And easy as it might be for a teacher to simply avoid such uncomfortable or offensive words or subject matter, there are several solid reasons for not doing so when being faced with this challenge, starting with the very general goals of exposing students to complex topics and building critical thinking skills, which I guess we can consider a global competency. In the case of confronting offensive or racist language, an argument has been made that doing so empowers second language students. Students who can't recognize racism, sexism, or other forms of discrimination certainly can't resist it or do anything about it. An article by Waterhouse argues that students are denied reliable access to this linguistic capital and symbolic power by institutionalized mechanisms if they are unaware of such language. And furthermore, there really aren't that many sources of information on so-called taboo language. There are a number of books like this that have been published for L2 speakers, but it seems like these tend to lean towards teaching students how to swear, and that's not really what we're talking about today. Finally, simply, students are going to encounter controversial topics and taboo language in the media, which of course is becoming more global and more accessible and more interconnected, and in regular life, especially on an international campus like ours here at Lakeland, or if they transfer to a school abroad. So today we'd like to briefly touch on 3 strategies for dealing with this kind of subject matter. One is establishing goodwill. Another is considering opposing perspectives. And finally, we're going to talk about using taboos as a jumping off point for discussing social and historical issues. So I'll start by talking about this concept of establishing goodwill. I teach the public speaking class here in the academic program at Lakeland, and my students' first 3 of 6 speeches are informational. They have to do a little bit of research and include that in their speeches. Any topic is okay, with the exception of my forbidden topics. They're boring, right? They've been done to death, right? Students who have been in a high school class or in an EAP class have done this before, so I want to challenge students to go beyond these. And I certainly don't require students to tackle controversial issues, but I encourage them to do so if they want to. As I said in the introduction, exposure to complex topics encourages critical thinking, among many other benefits. A Korean student came to me with a proposal to talk about the Dokdo-Takeshima territorial dispute, and I encouraged him to do so, but a day or 2 later he changed his mind and came to me to talk about this, and he said, "I'm afraid that I will offend the class." And my response to him was, "Do you hate Japan?" And he laughed because it was a joke, because he's married to a Japanese person and he lives here, and I know that it's a ridiculous question. And we had not yet gotten to this topic in the class, but we talked about the idea of establishing goodwill, particularly in the introduction of a speech like this. I mean, this is a timely and important topic, and it should be addressed in a college classroom. We shouldn't avoid it for fear of offending some classmates. So essentially, goodwill, the audience's perception of whether the speaker has the best interests of the audience in mind. Particularly outside the classroom, where speakers have a well-established reputation and may be identified with causes that arouse hostility among listeners, the speaker must try to diffuse that hostility right at the start of the speech. Put very simply, I don't hate you. I'm just giving you my opinions here. If students think that they're being lectured to or told that they're wrong or being talked down to, they'll probably just click, stop listening, or maybe even worse. So in this case, I encourage the student to be as academic and unemotional as possible. Pounding your fists in righteous indignation isn't going to change anybody's mind, even with a really emotional topic such as this. And to present the controversy in a larger context as well. Although, of course, I said please give your opinions and your own feelings as necessary. But with a touchy subject like this, establishing goodwill and reaching out to the audience is particularly necessary. So I'll read you just a tiny excerpt of what he said. He said, "Good morning. Territorial disputes are one of the major causes of wars. An example of this would be the ongoing dispute between Israel and Palestine. And he talked a little bit about that. And he continued, some disputes end up being peacefully solved, some end in war, and some continue to this day, like the territorial dispute over Dokdo Islands, known as Takeshima in Japanese. He did a very good job of not getting emotional, and he presented the reasons why Japan lays claim to these islands. And then, of course, he went into his own argument about Korea's right to the islands. And he continued, he said, I've been trying not to talk much about this issue in front of my Japanese friends because I don't want to be seen as such a Korean nationalist. Before I came to Japan, and he lived abroad a little bit, he said, before I came to Japan, I talked about this a lot with my Japanese friend, but what they said was quite different from what I learned in Korea. So, of course, nobody in the class was visibly offended, and I think that controversy was mostly averted. The only person who was really offended was me, because he went several minutes over the time limit. But it's probably not the last time that this student is going to encounter this controversy living in Japan as he does. And I think it provided the class a really good example of how to deal with it. A few weeks later, an American student came to me with a proposal to talk about medical marijuana in the United States called The Cannabis Controversy, which is a great title. And he had a lot of apprehension about doing this in front of a Japanese audience because of his perception of Japanese attitudes about marijuana and marijuana use. But after he gave me the proposal, I said, "You can't not do this now that you've showed it to me. Let's talk about how to present this." And indeed, he took great pains to acknowledge these Japanese attitudes towards marijuana before he talked about the controversy in the United States.
Okay, so to transition from there, I teach both in the EAP program and the academic program, and I'm going to give you an example from each, but I want to start by talking about my work with the EAP program. One of the classes that I teach is the advanced level listening and speaking course, and so my way of incorporating controversy has been through looking at debate. The students, some of them have had a little bit of experience with debate, but it's often with pretty tame topics, cats versus dogs, that sort of thing. So I encouraged them to choose something that was really being debated among governments, among populations. And the class actually chose, in a recent case, to look at gay marriage in the United States. So I said, okay, this is a fantastic topic, but if we're going to cover this, we're going to have to cover it respectfully. And so in order to do that, I set several guidelines. The first was their evaluation wouldn't just be about presentation skills and language. It would also include professionalism and expertise. And when I talked about professionalism, I said, this means choose your language well. You're going to take an emotional or a controversial topic, and you're going to talk about it in a way that sounds academic, that sounds like you know what you're talking about, that sounds like you could say it on TV and you wouldn't have a lynch mob outside your house. So I gave them a lot of coaching in that. We talked about what kind of terms are appropriate and what are not. And I also gave them the opportunity to come to me with questions and to say, is it okay if I say this? Are these words appropriate? The other thing that I was looking at was expertise. Right? I told them that a big part of a debate is not just knowing everything about your side, but also knowing everything about the other side, because you have to be able to come up with counter-arguments to what they're going to say. And so in doing this, I got them to step out of whatever side they'd chosen to support and also actively look into what the other side is thinking so that they could have a more balanced view on the issue. Then in addition to having them check the language with me, we also talked about ways to check the language themselves by visualizing that someone directly concerned is in the audience. I said, that you imagine that we have gays and lesbian people, or people whose brother or cousin or best friend is gay or lesbian or transgendered in the classroom. Are you going to say something that breaks their heart or makes them angry? Or on the other side, imagine you have someone who's deeply religious. Are you going to say something that offends their religion? So we worked on that kind of imagination and visualization, and then to drive the point home, I came up with a warm-up activity where I took the class and I divided them into two groups. Each group was both men and women, and the debate was that women are superior to men. And so each group had a side, and I said, now, how would you argue this without making your classmates hate you? how can you look them in the eyes and say what you're going to say without making them feel angry or upset or offended? And so this was very challenging for them, as it should be, but it forced them to really kind of think for themselves, not just in an abstract sense of am I offending my audience, but in a very real sense of what effect is this going to have on my friend who is looking at me as I speak. So we set it up with that. We had lots of time for practice, for research, for checks. And then when the actual debate happened, there was one slightly questionable word use, but the student even kind of caught himself afterwards and was like, was that okay, and came to me about it. But in general, I felt it was very successful. We had a very academic discussion with a set of very real reasons for both sides, stemming from religion and politics and everything else. And very interestingly, one student, he'd been absent on the day that we chose teams, and so by default he was put in the supporting gay side, the supporting gay marriage side, but he himself was kind of on the fence, perhaps leaning towards the other side, and so he came to me and said he was nervous about it, and I said, well, you should be in charge of the counter-arguments, because you know what the other side is thinking. But he came to me after the class and said that he'd really changed his mind, and that actually I think at our next school kind of art festival, he performed the Lady Gaga song Born This Way, which is the gay anthem, right? So that was a very big transition for him, and it really drove home to me how effective this kind of method could be. So I guess to summarize, just I feel like kind of training them to really look at how they're going to be reacted to when they speak has been very positive in encouraging them to find balanced ways to discuss the topic.
All right, next we'll talk about how putting controversies into a larger historical context can be a useful way of dealing with offensive language that we might encounter in the classroom. I teach a class called Reading Workshop, which is required for all the students who don't test out of it. I have a fair bit of freedom of what to do in addition to my required vocabulary and reading skills books. And this current semester will be the third time in which I'm going to use Of Mice and Men by John Sembe. As most of you who are American know, it's generally junior high school or high school. But given the nature of my students and the fact that they've never read an actual book in scare quotes before, it seems appropriate, and plus it's very short and manageable. Also, as you probably know, it has stirred up quite a bit of controversy since its publication. In particular, after 20 pages of exposition and plot development, here we have page 20, and it's the first of many, many times this word is used. So the first semester that I taught this book, I wasn't sure how this would play out because I had an African-American student in one section and an African-Japanese student in another section of the class. So initially I decided not to focus attention on it until we had read chapter 4, which is the chapter in which we meet Crooks, who's the character who's the black stable hand. And basically in his short appearance in the book, we realize that even though he's not allowed to live with the other ranch hands, and he's discriminated against, and he's referred to by this terrible word over and over, he's actually no different from the other guys on the ranch. He's painfully lonely, and he's suspicious of others, and those are two big themes that just keep repeating themselves through the book. So from the day I handed out the book, as a means of sort of selling my students on it, I kept saying, this is a classic of American literature, right? You know, this is so important, you guys. And so finally, after we read chapter 4, I repeated this grand claim once again, but this time I said, however, numerous attempts have been made all over the U.S. To ban and censor this book ever since it came out, pretty much. And I showed them this slide, this is a slide from one of the Banned Book Week's websites, and this only goes back to 2001, and it's got several examples of libraries and school districts trying to ban Of Mice and Men. So I asked my students, why do you think it has been banned and censored so frequently? And by the way, this is from Marshall University about its Banned Book Week, and there's several websites like this that show attempts to censor and ban literature. Anyway, my students' impressions ranged from, I don't know, to because the book is violent. One student said, I think it's because the book is sad, which a lot of to their credit, the other students laughed. But in both sections, the students managed to hit upon the course language, particularly that word. Fortunately, everybody seemed to understand the inappropriateness of this word, and not even the black students seemed to think it was a big deal in that context. But it did lead to a short and fruitful discussion about why Steinbeck would choose to include this word in his dialogue. So I'm from the United States, and I can't think of many words that are as taboo or controversial as that word in 21st century America. And this is an American college. So there's no way that I could not acknowledge this repeated use in this book that I'm requiring my students to read. So putting this in the historical context was an effective way of at least acknowledging that it's in this book.
As I mentioned before, I also teach U.S.-Japan relations, and so a big part of that is looking at World War II. When we look at World War II from the American perspective, we're confronted with all of this really angry language about the Japanese. Now, with a class where usually the main population of the class is Japanese students, this itself becomes a sensitive topic, and so it's something that I also have to address. So I start by using these examples to show how common, how widespread slurs against the Japanese were, how it was something that normal people were using in their businesses, even about how it was something that the government was using in its propaganda to create this very racialized image of the enemy. And we use this to talk about where this prejudice came from, how it was formed, what role it played in the nationalism of the time and in building the Japanese as an enemy. But then I also use this as a jumping off point to look at how this word has evolved and how or when it is used or not used today. So that I can look at this and I can say, at the time, everyone was using this. Even Superman was using this word. But that now, Superman wouldn't be caught dead using it, right? That now this is a word that is considered completely unacceptable, the J word. For Japanese students, sorry, since you can't see. What we talk about is how fighting against this racism became a part of the civil rights movement in terms of the Asian American branch of the civil rights movement, and the evolution of race relations between Asian Americans and white Americans. And so I try to use this kind of language and this time as a historical turning point in how the two races related to each other and build from there into what it's become today. And one reason why I do that is, as we mentioned in the beginning, I believe that awareness of this kind of language leads to empowerment. That if the students see or hear this, then they know how to react. And they know that, yes, it was acceptable in the 1940s, but that it should never be acceptable today, and that it's worth addressing if this is the kind of thing that they're hearing. So, to conclude, I'm going to read a script for this part, I'm sorry. To conclude, I'd like to re-emphasize the roles of these three skills within the context of global education. Students preparing to study or work in a global environment must be prepared for the challenges of misunderstanding and conflict, whether stemming from cultural differences, interpretations of history, or even ethnic intolerance. In teaching goodwill, respectful debate, and the socio-historical context of taboo language, we aim to promote level-headed self-expression, a willingness to view contentious situations from an opposing perspective, and the knowledge necessary to not only avoid using hate speech, but also recognize its use by others. Global citizenship implies a responsibility for confronting the world's problems head-on, and thus global education should be preparing students to question taboos and address controversies in a productive and beneficial manner. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
We'll hold the questions until all of the members have finished.